The young cowboy fed the Apache widow, not knowing she longed for more than just food. The sun rose slowly over the wide, empty plains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The wind whispered softly through the tall grasses, carrying the faint scent of dust and cattle. A young cowboy, barely out of his teens, rode along a narrow dirt trail, his worn boots tapping against the stirrups. His hat, tilted low over his eyes, cast a shadow across his tanned face. He had come to this part of the frontier seeking work, a place where he could earn enough to send money back home and perhaps make a life for himself. The land was harsh and the people here were cautious, but he liked the quiet and the freedom it offered. As he rode closer to the edge of a small settlement, he noticed smoke curling up in the distance. Not from the town, but from a small cluster of trees near a creek. Curious, he nudged his horse forward, careful not to make a sound. There, crouched near the water, was a woman gathering sticks. She moved with quiet precision, her hands steady despite the weight of the bundle. Her dark hair was pulled back, and her clothes were simple but neat. There was something about her, an air of resilience that caught the young cowboy's attention. He dismounted a few steps away, unsure if he should call out. He had heard stories about the Apache people from other cowboys, some true, some exaggerated. The frontier was full of misunderstandings, and he did not want to frighten her. Instead, he approached slowly, tipping his hat in greeting. "Morning," he said, his voice low but friendly. The woman looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. For a moment, she studied him quietly. Then, with a small nod, she replied, "Morning." Her voice was calm, controlled, yet there was a softness in it that made him think she was not as wary as he had expected. He noticed how thin her hands were, how careful she was with each stick she carried. It struck him that she might not have enough to eat, or enough help to manage even small tasks. Without thinking much about it, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a loaf of bread he had bought the day before, some cured meat, and a small jug of water. He held them out to her. "I thought you might like some food," he said. For a moment, she simply stared at the offering. Then, slowly, she set down her bundle and accepted it. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a grace in the way she took the food, as if it was not just sustenance, but also a gesture that carried meaning beyond its simplicity. The cowboy watched her, noticing how her lips curved slightly in a faint smile. He felt a strange warmth in his chest, a mix of pride and relief. He had not expected anything in return, yet seeing her gratitude made him feel that the small act had mattered. They sat together by the creek, the sun climbing higher in the sky, warming their backs. She unwrapped the bread and meat carefully, sharing a small portion with him, though he protested. "I can't let you eat alone," she said softly. The cowboy laughed, a light sound that seemed to surprise even him. "Fair enough," he said, and they ate in silence for a while, the only sounds being the water trickling over the rocks and the distant lowing of cattle. As they ate, the cowboy tried to make conversation, but the woman was reserved. She answered his questions in short, measured sentences, careful not to reveal too much. Still, there was a spark of curiosity in her eyes, as if she wanted to know more about him. He told her about the ranch where he worked, the long rides he took, and the open sky that made him feel free. She listened, nodding occasionally, and though she did not say much, he could see the interest in the way she tilted her head, how her eyes followed his every gesture. The day passed slowly. The young cowboy helped her carry more firewood to her small cabin, setting the heavier logs in neat piles. He noticed that her home was modest, a single room with a stone hearth, a small bed, and a few handmade items that reflected her care and resourcefulness. Despite the simplicity, it felt lived in, warm and safe, a sanctuary in the vast loneliness of the plains. As he worked, he observed the way she moved. Graceful, purposeful, even in the smallest tasks, It struck him that she had lived alone for some time, learning to rely on herself in ways he had never had to. There was a quiet strength about her, one that did not demand attention but naturally commanded it. He felt both admiration and a sense of humility in her presence. When the work was done, they sat on a fallen log near the edge of the trees, catching their breath. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the land. The woman pulled a small cloth from her pocket and handed it to him, dampened with cool creek water. "For your face," she said simply. He accepted it, brushing his brow and feeling an unexpected connection in this simple gesture. They watched the sky together as the colors shifted from gold to pink to deep purple. The young cowboy realized that he had never felt such calm, such peace, in all his travels. Here, away from the bustle of the ranch and the towns, he felt a quiet companionship he could not easily describe. And though she said little, he sensed that she too felt the same. As evening approached, he knew he had to return to the ranch before dark. He stood, dusted off his clothes, and tipped his hat once more. "I should get going," he said. She nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "Thank you," she said again, this time with more warmth in her voice. "You are welcome any time." The cowboy mounted his horse and looked back at her one last time. There was something about her silhouette against the fading light that made him pause, a feeling that this simple act of kindness was the start of something important, though he could not yet name it. The ride back was quiet, the plains bathed in the soft glow of twilight. He thought about the woman, her calm strength, and the way she had accepted his help without hesitation. It was a rare experience for him, an honest connection in a world often filled with suspicion and fear. By the time he reached the ranch, the stars were beginning to twinkle above, and the cool night air settled over the land. He tethered his horse and went inside, carrying with him not just the satisfaction of a day's work, but a growing sense of curiosity and wonder about the widow he had met. He did not yet know her name, her past, or the full story of her life, but he felt drawn to learn, to help, and perhaps to understand the quiet depth in her eyes. That night, as he lay on the cot in the bunkhouse, he thought again of her. He imagined her tending her small garden, preparing her modest meals, and sitting by the creek with the gentle rustle of leaves around her. He realized that the act of feeding her had been more than just giving food. It had been a gesture that opened a door he hoped to walk through slowly and carefully. He did not know what the future held, or whether he would ever truly understand the life of the Apache widow. But he knew one thing. The plains, with all their beauty and danger, had brought him to someone remarkable. And that first morning, with the sun rising and the world stretching endlessly around them, had planted a seed of connection that neither distance nor time could easily erase. As the night deepened, he drifted into sleep with the soft sounds of the ranch around him, the memory of her eyes and her quiet strength lingering in his mind. The frontier was vast and unpredictable, but in that moment he felt a small, steady warmth in his heart, a warmth that promised more than just the passing kindness of a shared meal. Days passed after their first meeting, and the young cowboy found himself returning to the edge of the settlement almost without thinking. Every morning he would ride along the same dirt trail, feeling the sun on his back and the wind in his hair. Sometimes he would glance at the horizon, wondering if she would be there, and most times she was. She moved among her garden and firewood with quiet efficiency, yet there was a calm beauty in the way she carried herself, something that seemed to belong to the land itself. The cowboy began to notice small details he had missed before: the careful way she tied her hair with a strip of cloth, the way her hands moved skillfully when handling a knife or organizing her small belongings, and the gentle tilt of her head when she was deep in thought. He admired her strength. In this harsh land, She seemed to have mastered the art of living with grace and resilience. He would bring food each visit, but gradually it became more than just a meal. He brought bread and meat, yes, but also small gifts, a spool of thread, a tin of sugar, a piece of cloth. She accepted them politely, always thanking him in her quiet voice. Sometimes she would invite him to sit with her by the creek or on a fallen log near the trees. He would hesitate at first, remembering the unspoken rules of their worlds, yet something in her eyes encouraged him to stay. Conversation grew slowly between them. At first it was simple, comments about the weather, the animals, or the land. Then, little by little, she began to share stories of her life, carefully, as though revealing too much might be dangerous. She spoke of her husband, who had died several years before, leaving her alone to manage a small piece of land. She described the loneliness that followed, the quiet evenings by herself, the hard work that left her body tired but her spirit determined. The cowboy listened, often speechless, realizing how different her life had been from his own. He told her about his work on the ranch, the long days in the sun, the challenges of managing cattle and horses, and the small joys of life on the open plains. She listened with genuine interest, nodding and asking questions. Sometimes she would laugh softly at his stories, a delicate sound that seemed to belong to the gentle rustle of leaves around them. He began to look forward to these moments, to the calm companionship they shared. Yet, even as their friendship deepened, there were moments of misunderstanding. The cowboy, inexperienced in the ways of her culture, sometimes misread her gestures. A look of curiosity, a small touch on a shared item, a lingering glance. He saw them as simple politeness or practicality. She, on the other hand, began to feel the stirrings of something more, a longing for connection that went beyond the surface of daily life. She admired his honesty, his willingness to help without expecting anything in return, and the quiet kindness that seemed rare in a world often harsh and unfeeling. The land itself played a role in their growing bond. The plains were wide and open, yet full of hidden dangers, wild animals, sudden storms, and the constant challenge of survival. The cowboy often helped her fortify her small cabin, mend fences and repair tools. She watched him work, noting the care he took in each task, the way he adjusted his movements to avoid wasting effort or harming himself. She began to trust him, not just as a helper, but as someone who might understand the quiet struggles of her life. One afternoon, a sudden summer storm swept across the plains. The wind rose quickly, carrying dust and leaves in swirling patterns, and heavy rain fell in sharp sheets. The widow struggled to secure her belongings, rushing from one task to another with urgency. The cowboy arrived just in time, guiding his horse through the muddy ground to her cabin. Together, they worked to protect her small home, moving buckets to catch rainwater, tying down loose items and covering the firewood. By the time the storm passed, they were both drenched and exhausted, but a sense of relief and accomplishment hung in the air. They sat by the creek, letting the water wash the mud from their boots, and shared a quiet meal. The widow looked at him with a soft expression, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something she had not yet named. He, still unaware, thought only of the satisfaction of helping someone in need, the simple joy of companionship and the vast loneliness of the plains. Over the following weeks, their meetings became a regular part of life. The cowboy would visit in the morning, and together they would manage small tasks, share meals, and talk. She began to ask for his opinions on matters of the cabin, the garden, or the animals, valuing his experience and perspective. He began to notice her subtle gestures, how she would linger near him when they walked, the small touches that seemed accidental but left a lasting impression. Yet he remained largely oblivious, focused on the tangible, practical aspects of life, rather than the emotional undercurrents flowing between them. One day, as they rested under the shade of a large oak, she told him about her dreams, not just the survival of her household, but the hope for something more. She spoke of her desire for companionship, for someone who could share not just the work of life, but the quiet joys and sorrows. The cowboy listened attentively, moved by her honesty, but he did not fully grasp the depth of her longing. He was more comfortable thinking in terms of actions, helping, providing, supporting, rather than emotions which were often difficult to name or express. The widow, sensing his limitations in understanding, did not press further. Instead, she allowed herself to enjoy the quiet moments they shared, the feeling of being seen and respected without words. She realized that even if love or companionship remained just out of reach, these small gestures of connection were meaningful and rare. Their bond, though unspoken, grew stronger. The cowboy began to notice the subtle ways she had influenced his life, the care she took in preparing meals, the wisdom she shared in tending the land, and the quiet strength that reminded him to be patient, observant, and thoughtful. He admired her resilience and learned to appreciate the small victories of daily life, understanding that strength often came not from force, but from patience, adaptability, and grace. Meanwhile, the widow observed the cowboy with increasing curiosity. She wondered what it was about him that made her feel both comforted and challenged, safe yet restless. She noticed how he moved through the world, how he treated animals, the way he spoke to people in the settlement, and how he treated her, not as someone weak or in need of pity, but as a person worthy of respect and attention. She began to hope, quietly, that one day he might recognize the bond they had forged, not just as friendship, but as something deeper. Life on the plains continued with its rhythms, sunrise and sunset, work and rest, the occasional storm or unexpected challenge. Through it all, they found a pattern, a sense of routine that brought stability and comfort. The cowboy arrived each morning, and together they faced the tasks of the day. Sometimes they shared laughter, sometimes silence, but always there was a sense of connection, a recognition of each other's presence and value. One evening, as the sky turned a soft lavender and the first stars appeared, the widow prepared a small meal for them both. She had baked bread, roasted a small portion of meat, and gathered herbs from her garden. They ate together in companionable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the gentle rustle of leaves. The cowboy looked at her and felt a quiet admiration, a deep respect for the life she had built with her own hands. As they sat together, she spoke softly about the changing seasons, the way the land shifted, and the importance of preparing for what was to come. He listened, realizing that her wisdom extended beyond practical matters. It was a knowledge of life, of endurance, and of the delicate balance between strength and humility. He felt grateful for her presence in his life, even if he did not yet understand the full depth of her feelings. The days turned into weeks, and their friendship became a natural part of each other's lives. The cowboy continued his work on the ranch, but he began to look forward to the moments spent with her. The widow, in turn, began to anticipate his visits, finding joy in the small gestures, the shared laughter, and the sense of being understood and respected. Though neither spoke of it openly, a quiet tension lingered, an unspoken recognition that their bond went beyond simple kindness. She longed for more than friendship, and he remained largely unaware of the emotional depth she offered. Yet both felt the significance of what they shared, understanding that even unspoken connections could shape lives in profound ways. And so life on the plains continued, shaped by the rhythms of work and nature, by the quiet growth of trust and understanding, and by the subtle, unspoken emotions that flowed between two people brought together by circumstance, kindness, and the vast open land. The young cowboy and the Apache widow had found something rare, a connection that nourished the heart, even if its full meaning remained just beyond reach. The days grew longer as summer edged toward fall, and the plains began to take on the golden-brown hue of the changing season. The young cowboy continued his visits, his rides becoming a steady rhythm in his life. Yet something in the air felt different now. There was a subtle shift in the way the widow looked at him. Sometimes a flicker of hope in her eyes, sometimes a shadow of sadness when she thought he would not understand. And though he had grown accustomed to her presence, he remained largely unaware of the depth of her feelings. One morning he arrived to find her sitting on a large rock near the creek, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was gazing at the water as though trying to see something far beyond the surface. The young cowboy dismounted slowly, sensing a quiet tension. "Good morning," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up and smiled faintly, but there was a heaviness in her expression that made him pause. "Morning," she replied. "I was thinking about the harvest. The garden will need extra care before the frost comes." "Ah," he nodded. "I can help. We can start today if you like." As they worked, she explained the delicate care the plants required, teaching him which vegetables could survive the coming cold and how to protect the soil. The cowboy listened attentively, impressed by her knowledge and the precision of her work. It struck him that she had learned to live in harmony with the land, a lesson he was only beginning to understand. While they worked side by side, the widow occasionally glanced at him, her heart quickening whenever he smiled or laughed. She longed for more than just these shared moments of labor. She wanted conversation that lingered beyond practical matters, touches that spoke without words, and the quiet reassurance of companionship that was deeper than friendship. But she remained cautious, aware of the unspoken rules of their worlds and the eyes of the settlement that could misinterpret any closeness between them. The young cowboy, meanwhile, was completely absorbed in the tasks at hand. He admired her skill and her resilience, yet he was slow to recognize the hints she dropped. An extended hand, a lingering glance, a small laugh that seemed meant for him alone. He thought her gestures were simply polite or natural, unaware that she was trying to communicate feelings that words could not fully express. As the day progressed, a minor conflict arose. Some of the townsfolk had begun noticing the cowboy's frequent visits and whispered among themselves. A few made remarks that reached his ears, implying that he might be courting someone outside his own community. He was puzzled and somewhat uncomfortable. He respected the widow deeply, but his thoughts remained focused on practical concerns, helping her with chores, ensuring she had enough food, and keeping her home safe. The idea of romance had never entered his mind. When he mentioned the gossip to her, she smiled faintly, shaking her head. "People will always talk," she said calmly. "It does not matter. We know the truth of our actions, and that is what counts." Her words carried a wisdom and grace that made him feel both comforted and slightly inadequate, as though he had much to learn about life beyond work and duty. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, a sudden summer storm swept across the plains once again. Dark clouds rolled in quickly, and the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's shutters. The widow hurried to secure her belongings, her movements quick but precise. The cowboy arrived just as the first heavy drops of rain fell, his horse splashing through the mud. Together, they moved swiftly to protect her home, tying down loose items and covering the firewood. As the storm raged, the widow paused to look at him, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. There was an intensity in her gaze, a silent plea for him to understand more than what he could see. Yet he remained focused on practical matters, tying a rope here, moving a log there, unaware of the emotional undercurrent that flowed between them. By the time the storm passed, they were soaked and exhausted. They sat near the creek, letting the cool water run over their boots, sharing a small meal of bread and roasted meat. The widow looked at him with a softness that spoke of gratitude, admiration, and longing. He noticed her expression but interpreted it as simple appreciation for his help, not realizing the deeper emotions she was trying to convey. Over the next several weeks, subtle tensions began to rise. The widow's gestures grew more deliberate. She would brush a stray lock of hair from her face, linger near him as they walked, or find excuses to be close when they worked together. The cowboy, absorbed in the routine and practicalities of life, failed to recognize these signals. His admiration for her resilience and skill was genuine, but he lacked the awareness to understand her emotional hints. One evening they sat together on a fallen log, watching the sun set in a blaze of red and gold. She spoke softly about her hopes, the quiet wish for companionship, and the desire for someone who could share not just her work but her life. He listened, moved by her words, yet he responded only with encouragement and respect, not realizing the depth of her feelings. Despite this misunderstanding, their bond continued to grow. The cowboy learned to value her perspective on life, her insights into the land, and her quiet wisdom. He began to adjust his own ways, noticing the small rhythms of the plains, appreciating the importance of patience, and understanding that strength often came in subtle forms rather than loud displays. The widow, in turn, found comfort in his steady presence. She knew he was honest, dependable, and kind, qualities that were rare and precious in the harsh frontier life. Yet she could not help but feel a quiet ache, a longing for recognition and connection that remained just out of reach. She wondered if he would ever see the depth of her feelings, or if he would continue to see their interactions as simple friendship. One day, as they repaired a small fence near her cabin, she took a deep breath and tried to communicate more directly. "You are very kind," she said softly, her voice almost trembling. "More than most people I have known. But kindness is not always enough. Sometimes hearts need more than help. They need understanding, attention, and someone who sees them." The cowboy paused, looking at her with genuine curiosity and concern. He did not fully grasp her meaning, but he sensed the importance of her words. I try to help," he said, uncertain. "I want to make things easier for you." She smiled faintly, a mixture of hope and sadness in her eyes. "And you do. But sometimes help alone is not what the heart seeks." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning he could not yet interpret. As the days grew colder and the first hints of frost appeared on the plains, they continued their work together, side by side. The cowboy began to notice more: the small ways she looked at him, the moments of hesitation in her movements, the unspoken communication in her eyes. Yet he struggled to understand, seeing only glimpses of what lay beneath the surface. Their bond, though still unspoken, deepened. They shared meals, stories, and laughter, and faced the challenges of the frontier together. The widow began to sense that the cowboy cared for her in ways he had yet to recognize, while he admired her skill, strength, and wisdom, without realizing the emotional depth she offered. One chilly morning, as they walked along the creek collecting firewood, the widow paused and looked at him seriously. "I am grateful for your presence," she said quietly. "It makes life less lonely, but I hope one day you understand that there is more to what we share than work and meals. There is a connection that is hard to name." The cowboy stopped, considering her words. He wanted to respond, to reassure her, but he felt unsure. He knew he cared for her, respected her, and enjoyed her company, but he did not yet have the language to express what was growing in his heart. Instead, he nodded slowly and said, "I will try. I promise I will try to understand." For the widow, that promise was enough for the moment. She did not know if he would ever fully understand her feelings, but she felt that he was willing to try, and that was a rare and precious gift. She smiled softly, turning back to gather the wood. feeling a small warmth in her chest despite the chill of the morning air. As the sun set that evening, painting the plains in orange and purple, they sat together on a fallen log, watching the world grow quiet. The cowboy felt a deep sense of peace in her presence, a feeling that went beyond friendship, though he did not yet name it. The widow felt the stirrings of hope and longing, knowing that their bond was growing stronger, even if its full meaning remained unspoken. In the weeks that followed, their lives continued in this delicate balance of work, shared moments, and subtle tension. The cowboy grew more attentive, noticing the small ways she expressed care and concern, while the widow continued to hope that one day he would understand the depth of her feelings. Together they navigated the challenges of the frontier, finding in each other a steady presence, a source of comfort, and a quiet connection that enriched their lives in ways neither could fully describe. The first frost of the season settled softly over the plains, coating the tall grasses with a delicate layer of ice. The young cowboy rode through the crisp morning air, the wind biting at his cheeks, his breath forming clouds in front of him. He felt a sense of urgency he could not explain, as though the changing season had brought with it an invisible shift, reminding him that time on the frontier was fleeting. The days were growing shorter, the nights colder, and he knew that soon the routines of summer would give way to the harsher realities of winter. When he reached the edge of the settlement, he saw her at her cabin, tending a small fire to warm her hands. The widow looked up, her dark eyes meeting his, and for a moment there was silence. The world around them seemed to pause, the whispering wind, the distant sound of a creek, even the low calls of cattle in the fields beyond, all of it fading into the background. She smiled softly, her expression calm yet filled with unspoken emotion. "Good morning," he said, his voice a little hesitant. "Ah ha 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 ha!" He had grown used to seeing her this way, calm and composed, but today something in her gaze made his chest tighten. "Morning," she replied. She paused for a moment before adding, "The frost has arrived earlier than expected. We'll need to protect the garden." "I can help. Let's get started." They worked together in silence for a while, gathering protective covers and checking each plant carefully. The air was crisp and sharp, and their breath rose in white puffs as they moved. The cowboy noticed the delicate care she gave to each task, the same care she had shown in everything she did. She worked with patience, precision, and a quiet grace that he could not help but admire. As they finished, they paused to rest near the creek. The widow looked at him thoughtfully, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea she had prepared. "You have helped me more than I can say," she said quietly. "Not just with the work, but with your presence. It has made life easier and brighter." The cowboy met her gaze, feeling an unfamiliar warmth rise in his chest. He realized that her words carried more than gratitude. They carried something deeper, a quiet hope, a longing he had not yet recognized. He wanted to respond, to tell her that he felt the same, but words failed him. Instead, he simply nodded, allowing the silence to speak for both of them. The next days were filled with small, shared routines. They repaired fences, collected firewood, and prepared the garden for the coming winter. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they worked in comfortable silence. The cowboy began to notice her small gestures more clearly, the way she would pause and watch him when he worked, the subtle care in her movements, the occasional lingering smile that seemed meant for him alone. Slowly, he began to understand that their connection was no longer just friendship. One evening, a cold wind swept across the plains, and the cowboy found her struggling to secure a loose shutter on her cabin. He rushed to help, tying it down carefully as she held the other end. For a moment they stood close, their shoulders nearly touching, and he caught the faint scent of her hair mixed with the crisp air. His heart raced, and he realized that he had been blind to her feelings until now. I didn't realize, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't see how much you wanted, more than help. She looked at him, her eyes wide but gentle. It is not your fault, she said. I never expected you to see it. I only hoped you might. Her voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the courage of saying something that had been hidden for so long. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the plains in shades of orange and purple, and the wind whispered through the grasses around them. The cowboy reached out tentatively, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I see it now, he said. And I care. More than I realized. Her lips curved into a small, relieved smile. I wondered if you ever would, she whispered. From that evening on, their lives began to change in subtle but profound ways. The cowboy remained at her side, not just as a helper, but as a companion. He helped with the cabin, the garden, and the animals, but he also shared in the quiet moments of life, watching the sunrise, listening to the wind, and talking about dreams and hopes they had never voiced before. The widow, in turn, allowed herself to lean on him more fully, finding comfort and companionship in his presence. Despite the harshness of frontier life, they discovered small joys together. They would share meals by the fire, telling stories of the past and plans for the future. Sometimes they would simply sit in silence, their hands brushing accidentally as they passed tools or firewood. Each touch, each glance, carried a new depth of meaning, building a quiet intimacy that neither had experienced before. Yet life on the plains remained unpredictable. One cold morning, the cowboy noticed tracks in the snow, wolves drawn close by hunger. He warned her to stay inside while he went to check the perimeter. The widow watched him go, her heart racing with concern and admiration. He returned after several tense hours, having ensured that their small homestead was safe. She greeted him with a warm cup of tea, her hands slightly trembling from worry. You're brave, she said quietly, and kind. I am glad you are here. He took her hand gently, holding it in both of his. And I am glad to be here, he said, with you. His words, simple as they were, carried the weight of a promise that went beyond protection or friendship, one that spoke of companionship, understanding, and shared life. The first snow fell lightly one evening, covering the plains in a blanket of white. They stood together outside the cabin, watching the flakes drift to the ground. The cowboy wrapped a blanket around the widow's shoulders, and she leaned into him, feeling the warmth and safety he provided. For the first time, they allowed themselves to acknowledge the depth of their feelings fully, without fear or hesitation. Winter settled over the land, harsh and unforgiving, yet their bond remained strong. They faced challenges together, from icy winds to frozen water sources, supporting one another through every trial. The cowboy learned more about the widow's culture, her ways of living in harmony with the land, and her quiet wisdom. She, in turn, discovered the depth of his character, his honesty, courage, and steadfastness in the face of hardship. They shared quiet evenings by the fire, the glow of the flames illuminating their faces. Sometimes they would talk about the past, about losses and regrets, and about the lives they had once imagined for themselves. Other times they would simply sit, letting the silence speak for them, the sound of the wind outside and the crackling fire inside forming a comforting rhythm. As the months passed, the cowboy began to understand the subtle language of gestures and glances that the widow had used for so long. He realized that love was not always expressed in words. but in the way one cared for another, in the small acts of kindness, the shared labor, and the silent companionship of facing life together. One evening, as they sat outside watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky, the widow spoke softly. "I never thought I would find someone who truly sees me," she said, "who understands that my heart longs for more than work, more than survival. And yet, here you are." The cowboy took her hands in his, holding them firmly but gently. "I see you now," he said, "all of you, and I want to be here with you, not just to help, but to share life with you." Tears of relief and joy filled her eyes. She smiled, leaning into him, feeling a sense of peace she had not known in years. The harshness of the frontier, the loneliness and the struggles seemed to fade in that moment, replaced by the warmth of connection, understanding, and love. The weeks that followed were filled with a quiet happiness. They continued to work side by side, but now there was a deeper understanding between them. The cowboy noticed the little things, the way she hummed softly while working, the care she took in arranging the cabin, the joy in her eyes when he succeeded at a task she taught him. She, in turn, appreciated his steady presence, his willingness to learn, and the genuine care he showed not just in actions, but in understanding her heart. Spring approached once again, bringing with it the promise of renewal. The garden bloomed, the creek ran clear and strong, and the plains shimmered with life. The cowboy and the widow walked together along the familiar trails, their hands brushing, their laughter mingling with the sounds of the land. They had faced storms, cold, and the challenges of frontier life together, and in doing so had built something rare, a bond of trust, respect, and love. Though their story began with a simple act of kindness, sharing food, helping with chores, it had grown into something far deeper. They had discovered that true connection required patience, understanding, and the courage to see and be seen. And in the quiet of the plains, under the vast sky, they had found in each other not just companionship, but a shared life filled with warmth, hope, and the promise of tomorrow. And so life continued on the plains, shaped by seasons, work, and the rhythm of nature, but forever changed by the bond between a young cowboy and an Apache widow, a bond born from kindness, nurtured by respect, and fulfilled by love. In the stillness of the evening, as they watched the sun dip below the horizon, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, side by side, hearts aligned in the vast open world they called home.